The flare trail carved a perfect crescent against the Afghan night sky, its phosphorus glow fading just as the last Taliban muzzle flash died in the valley below. 23 Navy SEALs watched from their extraction point, mud-caked and bleeding, as the A-10 Thunderbolt II banked hard left and disappeared into the darkness. None of them knew they had just witnessed the rebirth of a legend that had been buried in classified files for 37 years. Lieutenant Commander Vera Kingfish Kazansky didn't hear the radio chatter praising her gun runs. She was too focused on the fuel gauge reading 18 minutes to bingo, the hydraulic pressure warning light that had been flickering for the past hour, and the fact that her wingman's aircraft had taken heavy damage and was limping back to Bagram on fumes. What she did hear, crystal clear through the static, was SEAL Team 6's ground commander. Unknown A-10, you just saved 23 lives. We don't know who you are, but we won't forget. The mystery wasn't who had flown the mission. That was easy enough to trace through flight logs. The mystery was why every SEAL in that valley swore they saw something impossible in those flare patterns, something that made hardened operators stop mid-stride and stare at the sky with recognition they couldn't quite place. Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, 30-year veteran with more classified missions than most people had birthdays, claimed he'd seen that exact pattern before. The problem was, according to official records, what he claimed to remember had never existed. The investigation began 3 days later when a Pentagon analyst noticed an anomaly in the after-action reports. 17 different SEALs had independently described the flare pattern using identical language, like a broken trident pointing home. The phrase appeared nowhere in any manual, training document, or operational guideline. It wasn't military terminology. It wasn't slang. It was something else entirely. Kazansky herself remained unaware of the investigation brewing around her routine close air support mission. She was dealing with more immediate concerns, a reprimand for unnecessarily depleting ordnance stores, and whispered comments about female pilots who took too many risks to prove themselves. Her squadron mates called her Kingfish because of her call sign's ironic contrast to her small stature and quiet demeanor. What they didn't know was that the call sign hadn't been randomly assigned. It had been specifically chosen by a personnel officer who recognized something in Kazansky's file, something that connected her to a story the military had spent decades trying to forget. The first clue lay buried in her grandmother's effects, discovered only when Kazansky returned home for emergency leave to settle the estate. Between yellowed photographs and service medals was a leather flight jacket bearing squadron patches from units that didn't exist in any official registry. The radio crackled to life as Kazansky's A-10 approached the target coordinates, her voice steady despite the complexity of the mission ahead. Viper 17, this is Kingfish. I have visual on the compound. Multiple heat signatures estimate 20-plus hostiles. SEAL team, what's your status? The response came through layers of static and tension. Kingfish, this is Trident Actual. We're pinned down heavy northeast corner. They've got us bracketed with mortars and heavy machine guns. We need immediate close air support, or we're not making it out. Kazansky banked her aircraft 40 degrees left, studying the infrared display that painted the battlefield in ghostly green. The SEALs were trapped in a dried riverbed, enemy positions surrounding them in a textbook L-shaped ambush. Standard protocol called for high-altitude gun runs to minimize ground fire exposure. Instead, she pushed the stick forward, diving her 21-ton aircraft toward the deck until she could make out individual muzzle flashes. Trident Actual, I'm coming in low and fast. Mark your positions with strobes and keep your heads down. Master Chief Rodriguez pressed himself against the rocky embankment, watching tracer rounds streak past his position like deadly fireworks. His team had been operating in Afghanistan for 8 months, but this firefight was different. The enemy had anticipated their extraction route, positioned themselves with military precision that spoke of professional training rather than insurgent tactics. Kingfish, be advised, he transmitted, these aren't your typical Taliban fighters. They're moving with discipline and coordination, possible foreign advisors. The A-10's twin General Electric TF-34 engine screamed overhead as Kazansky lined up her first gun run. Through her targeting system, she could see the enemy positions clearly. Sandbag emplacements, crew-served weapons, fighters moving with the kind of tactical awareness that came from real military training. She selected her 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon and began her attack run. "Guns, guns, guns," she announced over the radio, the traditional call-out that warned friendly forces of incoming fire. The cannon's distinctive buzzsaw sound echoed through the valley as depleted uranium rounds tore through enemy positions at 65 rounds per second. Kazansky pulled up hard, feeling the G-forces press her into her ejection seat, then immediately rolled into a second attack run. The enemy return fire was intense but poorly coordinated, exactly what she had expected after disrupting their command structure. "Outstanding work, Kingfish," came Rodriguez's voice. "You broke their formation. We're moving to secondary extract now." But as Kazansky climbed back to altitude, something nagged at her. The enemy positions, the tactical setup, even the way they had responded to her attack, it all felt familiar in a way she couldn't quite place. The debrief should have been routine. Kazansky sat in the sterile conference room at Bagram, still wearing her flight suit, sweat stains mapping the intensity of the 3-hour mission. Across from her, Major Patterson flipped through pages of preliminary reports, his expression growing more perplexed with each detail. "Lieutenant Commander, your gun camera footage shows exceptional accuracy, textbook close air support, but I need to ask about your approach pattern." He paused, consulting his notes. "Multiple ground personnel reported seeing your flare deployment in what they described as an unusual configuration." Kazansky shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Sir, I deployed flares according to standard threat response protocols. Our guided missiles were being fired from multiple positions. I had to break their lock-on capability while maintaining effective fire support for the ground team." Her answer was technically accurate, but she knew it didn't address what Patterson was really asking about. She had felt something during that mission, an instinct that guided her flare pattern, but explaining instinct to a by-the-book major was like explaining color to the blind. The door opened, and Colonel Martinez entered, carrying a manila folder marked with classification stamps Kazansky didn't recognize. "Major Patterson, I'll take it from here." His tone carried the weight of authority that comes with 30 years of military service and secrets that went deeper than most people's security clearance. As Patterson left, Martinez settled into his chair with the careful movements of someone carrying invisible burdens. "Kingfish," he began, using her call sign in a way that suggested familiarity beyond her service record. "What I'm about to show you is classified at levels that don't technically exist in the normal chain of command. Before we continue, I need to ask you directly. Has anyone in your family ever mentioned a military unit called the Phantom Tridents?" The name hit Kazansky like a physical blow. Memories flooded back. Her grandmother's stories about her grandfather, the one who had died before Kazansky was born. Stories about a special aviation unit that flew missions that never officially happened, supporting ground operations that weren't supposed to exist. Stories that her family had always assumed were the embellished tales of an old woman trying to make sense of her husband's mysterious military service. "My grandmother used to tell stories," Kazansky admitted quietly, "but I thought they were just stories." Colonel Martinez opened the folder and removed a black and white photograph showing a group of pilots standing beside aircraft that looked wrong somehow, familiar shapes with unfamiliar modifications. In the center of the group stood a man whose facial features Kazansky recognized from family photos. Below the image, in faded ink, someone had written, "Phantom Trident Squadron Classification Level, SBECTRE 1980-71991." The investigation that followed Martinez's revelation moved with the kind of bureaucratic momentum that only emerged when someone with serious connections wanted answers. Kazansky found herself temporarily reassigned to a Pentagon office that didn't appear on any organizational chart. working with analysts who introduced themselves only by first names and seemed to have unlimited access to files that were supposed to be destroyed decades ago. Dr. Emily Chen, if that was her real name, spread dozens of documents across a conference table that had probably hosted discussions about operations most Americans would never know existed. Your grandfather, Captain James Reaper Kazansky, was part of an experimental program that combined special aviation tactics with psychological operations. The Phantom Tridents weren't just a flying unit. They were a proof of concept for aircraft-based support of deep cover operations. Kazansky studied a mission report dated 3 months before her own birth. The tactical diagrams showed aircraft deployment patterns that were almost identical to what she had instinctively flown over Afghanistan. The flare configurations, the attack angles, even the radio protocols, everything matched with unsettling precision. Are you telling me that I somehow inherited these tactics, that I'm genetically programmed to fly like my grandfather? Chen smiled, but it wasn't a comfortable expression. We're telling you that the Phantom Trident Squadron developed tactics that were so effective, so specifically calibrated to support special operations, that we've been trying to recreate them for 37 years. Every simulation, every training program, every attempt to reverse engineer their methods has failed. Until 3 nights ago, when a SEAL team watched you fly patterns that matched your grandfather's combat footage frame by frame. The implications were staggering. If Kazansky could naturally replicate tactics that the military's best minds couldn't decode, she wasn't just a pilot. She was the key to unlocking capabilities that could revolutionize special operations support. But as she stared at her grandfather's photograph, she wondered if some secrets were buried for good reasons. The folder Chen handed her was thicker than a phone book and marked with warning labels that made Kazansky's security clearance seem like a library card. Your grandfather's final mission, Chen explained, was supporting a SEAL extraction in Grenada that officially never happened. The ground team was pinned down by forces that shouldn't have been there, using equipment that wasn't supposed to exist. Sound familiar? The mission photographs were grainy and dark, but Kazansky could make out shapes that made her blood run cold. Enemy positions arranged in the same L-shaped ambush pattern she had encountered in Afghanistan. The same tactical spacing, the same weapon emplacements, even the same natural terrain features that had been used for cover. It was as if someone had taken her grandfather's final battle and recreated it exactly, 37 years later, waiting for her to stumble into the same scenario. Dr. Chen, Kazansky said slowly, are you suggesting that what happened to me wasn't random, that someone deliberately engineered a situation designed to trigger? Whatever this is, she gestured at the photographs, the tactical diagrams, the evidence of inherited military instincts that shouldn't be possible. Chen's expression grew grave. We're suggesting that there are people who remember the Phantom Tridents, people who understand what your grandfather's unit was capable of, and people who have been waiting a very long time for someone with his bloodline to emerge in the military system. The question is whether they're trying to recreate the program, or destroy the last person who could make it work. The security implications were immediately obvious. If hostile intelligence services knew about Kazansky's capabilities, her next mission wouldn't just be dangerous. It would be a trap designed specifically to exploit her tactical instincts. But if she could learn to control and understand these inherited abilities, she could become the foundation for a new generation of special operations support that would revolutionize modern warfare. Outside the conference room window, Kazansky watched aircraft taking off from Andrews Air Force Base, their contrails writing temporary stories across the sky. Soon, she would be flying again, carrying with her the weight of family legacy and the possibility that her next mission might be her last. The training program they designed for Kazansky was unlike anything in modern military doctrine. Rather than teaching her new tactics, the focus was on helping her understand and control the instincts that had emerged during combat. Dr. Sarah Hoffman, a military psychologist with specialized experience in inherited trauma responses, explained the theoretical framework during their first session. What you experienced wasn't supernatural or genetic programming. It was the result of stories, conversations, and subconscious details absorbed during childhood that your conscious mind never processed. Kazansky found herself in a flight simulator that had been modified with her grandfather's actual mission parameters. As the scenario unfolded, enemy positions materializing on her display in familiar patterns, she felt the same instinctive responses that had guided her over Afghanistan. "Dr. Hoffman," she said into her headset, "this doesn't feel like learned behavior. This feels like muscle memory for muscles I've never used." The psychological evaluation revealed something unexpected. Kazansky's childhood had been shaped by subtle influences no one had recognized. Her grandmother's bedtime stories had included tactical details disguised as adventure tales. Family photographs had been arranged to highlight specific aircraft configurations. Even the way her grandmother had taught her to read maps and navigate during camping trips had incorporated military navigation principles that Kazansky had absorbed without realizing their significance. "Your grandfather didn't just serve in the Phantom Tridents," Dr. Hoffman explained. "He helped develop their core tactical philosophy, and your grandmother, whether consciously or unconsciously, spent your entire childhood preparing you to carry on that legacy. She was a military intelligence analyst before she married your grandfather. She knew exactly what she was doing." The revelation transformed Kazansky's understanding of her own identity. Every camping trip, every navigation lesson, every story about adventure and heroism had been carefully designed to develop specific cognitive patterns. Her grandmother hadn't just been sharing family history. She had been conducting an 18-year training program disguised as loving grandparental attention. But the most disturbing discovery came when they analyzed her grandfather's final mission in detail. The enemy force that had killed him hadn't been random insurgents or conventional military units. They had been a specialized counter-aviation team, trained specifically to engage and destroy close air support aircraft, using tactics designed to exploit the Phantom Trident operational methods. Someone had studied her grandfather's unit, learned their weaknesses, and designed a trap that had successfully eliminated the program's most effective pilot. Now, 37 years later, that same someone was apparently ready to spring the same trap again. The briefing room felt different when Kazansky entered for her next operational assignment. Colonel Martinez was there, along with Chen and two men in civilian clothes who didn't bother introducing themselves. The mission folder was thicker than usual, marked with classification levels that suggested this operation existed in the spaces between official military doctrine and plausible deniability. "Lieutenant Commander," Martinez began, "we're sending you back to Afghanistan. Intelligence indicates that the same foreign advisors who have been training Taliban units in advanced tactics are planning a major operation. SEAL Team 6 has been tasked with interdicting their leadership conference, and they've specifically requested you for close air support." Kazansky studied the mission parameters, recognizing the tactical signature immediately. The target location was a compound built into mountainous terrain that offered natural defensive advantages. The enemy force was estimated at 40 to 60 fighters with heavy weapons and possible surface-to-air missile capability. The extraction route would take the SEAL team through a valley that was perfect for an L-shaped ambush. "Sir," she said carefully, "this mission profile is almost identical to my grandfather's final operation. Are we walking into the same trap that killed him?" One of the civilian advisors spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the flat affect of someone who had spent too many years dealing with uncomfortable truths. "We're counting on it, Lieutenant Commander. The people who killed your grandfather have been planning this operation for decades. They expect you to react the same way he did, to make the same tactical decisions. What they don't expect is that you know they're waiting." The implication was clear. Kazansky wasn't just flying close air support. She was the bait in a counterintelligence operation designed to eliminate a threat that had been operating in the shadows for nearly 4 decades. Her inherited tactical instincts weren't just military capabilities. They were the key to identifying and destroying an enemy that had remained hidden since her grandfather's death. As she signed the mission acceptance documents, Kazansky wondered if her grandmother had known this day would come, if every bedtime story and navigation lesson had been preparing her not just to fight like her grandfather, but to finish the war he had started. The pre-flight inspection revealed modifications to Kazansky's A-10 that weren't in any technical manual she had seen. Additional fuel tanks had been installed to extend her loiter time over the target area. Her flare dispensers had been loaded with specialized countermeasures that could defeat missile systems that weren't supposed to exist in Taliban hands. Most significantly, her aircraft's identification systems had been modified to broadcast the same electronic signature that her grandfather's plane had used during Phantom Trident operations. Master Chief Rodriguez approached as she completed her external inspection, his expression reflecting the kind of professional concern that came from too many operations where the intelligence had been wrong. Kingfish, my team's been briefed on the tactical situation. We know this mission has historical significance for you. I want you to know that we've got your back, but we need you to have ours too. If you see something that doesn't match the operational parameters, you call it out immediately. Kazansky nodded, understanding the subtext. Rodriguez knew that she might encounter situations that triggered inherited tactical responses, but he needed her to remain focused on the immediate mission rather than fighting her grandfather's war. Master Chief, I won't let personal history compromise operational effectiveness. You have my word. The flight to the target area took 2 hours, giving Kazansky time to study the intelligence package and consider the tactical implications of what she had learned. If the enemy force was indeed connected to her grandfather's death, they would have studied Phantom Trident methods extensively. They would expect specific approach patterns, anticipated flare deployment sequences, and predicted her likely responses to various threat scenarios. But they had made one critical error in their planning. They had prepared to fight her grandfather, not her. James Reaper Kazansky had been a product of Vietnam-era military doctrine, trained in tactics that emphasized overwhelming firepower and decisive engagement. Vera Kingfish Kazansky was a product of modern counterinsurgency operations, trained in precision strikes and surgical support of small unit operations. As she approached the target coordinates, Kazansky activated her radio and established contact with the ground team. Trident Actual, this is Kingfish. I'm 5 minutes out from your position. Current weather is clear, visibility unlimited, and I'm showing green on all systems. What's your situation? Rodriguez's voice came through clearly, professional but tense. Kingfish, we're in position overlooking the target compound. Intelligence was accurate, heavy security presence, multiple vehicle positions, and at least 2 crew-served weapon emplacements. We're also picking up electronic signatures that suggest more sophisticated air defense capability than anticipated. The surface-to-air missile warning was exactly what Kazansky had expected based on her grandfather's mission files. The enemy had spent 37 years preparing for this engagement, and they weren't going to rely on small arms fire to bring down her aircraft. The compound materialized on Kazansky's targeting display exactly as the intelligence photographs had depicted, but something felt wrong. The defensive positions were too perfect, too obviously designed to channel an attacking aircraft into specific approach corridors. The crew-served weapons were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire that would force her to fly predictable patterns. Even the terrain seemed to have been modified to eliminate alternative attack routes. Trident Actual, she transmitted. I'm seeing a tactical setup that looks like it was designed specifically to engage close air support aircraft. Recommend you hold position while I conduct a detailed reconnaissance of the target area. Rodriguez acknowledged her transmission, but Kazansky could hear tension in his voice. The SEAL team was exposed on the mountainside with limited cover, and every minute they remained in position increased their risk of detection. But rushing into an obvious trap would accomplish nothing except getting everyone killed. As she orbited the target area at 10,000 feet, Kazansky began to see the pattern. The compound wasn't just a meeting location for foreign advisors. It was a carefully constructed kill zone designed to replicate the tactical conditions that had eliminated her grandfather. Every defensive position, every weapon emplacement, every approach corridor had been positioned to force her into the same tactical decisions that had proven fatal 37 years earlier. But recognizing the trap was only the first step. Now she had to figure out how to spring it without getting caught in it herself. The answer came from an unexpected source, her grandmother's voice, echoing from childhood memories of camping trips and navigation lessons. When you can't go through an obstacle, Vera, and you can't go around it, sometimes the only option is to go over it or under it. The lesson had been about hiking trails and creek crossings, but as Kazansky studied the enemy positions, she realized it applied perfectly to her current tactical situation. The enemy had prepared for horizontal attacks, gun runs that would bring her within range of their air defense systems. They had positioned their weapons to create a three-dimensional kill zone that covered every conventional approach to the target. But they had made the same mistake that many ground-based forces made when planning anti-aircraft defenses. They had forgotten that modern close air support aircraft could deliver ordnance vertically. "Trident Actual," Kazansky transmitted. "I'm going to try something unconventional. I need you to mark the primary target building with your laser designator and then move to minimum safe distance. I'm coming in from directly overhead." Rodriguez's response reflected his concern. "Kingfish, are you planning a vertical attack run? That's going to put you well within range of any surface-to-air systems they might have." "Negative, Master Chief. I'm not planning an attack run at all." Kazansky selected her AGM-65 Maverick missiles and began climbing to 15,000 feet, well above the effective ceiling of most portable air defense systems. "I'm planning to let gravity do the work." The tactical concept was simple but required precise execution. Instead of diving toward the target and exposing herself to ground fire, Kazansky would release her missiles from maximum altitude and use their internal guidance systems to strike the compound vertically. The approach would minimize her exposure time and attack from an angle that the enemy defensive positions weren't designed to counter. But the plan required perfect timing and coordination with the ground team. If Rodriguez's laser designation was off by even a few meters, the missiles would miss their target, and the SEAL team would be exposed in an active combat zone with no effective fire support. "Laser on target," Rodriguez reported. "I have solid designation on the primary building." Kazansky lined up her shot, compensating for wind speed and the ballistic trajectory of her missiles at extreme range. "Missiles away," she announced, then immediately began a steep climbing turn to gain altitude and distance from any possible retaliation. The explosions, when they came, were more spectacular than she had expected. The primary target building disintegrated in a fireball that suggested the enemy had been storing significant quantities of ammunition or explosives. Secondary explosions followed as the initial blast triggered sympathetic detonations throughout the compound. But as the smoke cleared, Kazansky realized that destroying the buildings had been the easy part. Now she had to deal with the surviving enemy forces, who were undoubtedly frustrated and angry that their carefully planned ambush had been neutralized by tactics they hadn't anticipated. "Kingfish, this is Trident Actual," Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio, tight with professional urgency. "Primary target is destroyed, but we're taking heavy fire from secondary positions. Multiple enemy fighters moving to surround our location. We need immediate close air support or we're going to be overrun." Kazansky banked her aircraft hard left, studying her tactical display as enemy positions lit up across the mountainside. The surviving fighters had abandoned their prepared defensive positions and were now moving aggressively toward the SEAL team's location. Without the constraint of their carefully planned ambush, they were adapting their tactics in real time, using the terrain and their superior numbers to press their advantage. Trident Actual, I count approximately 30 enemy fighters converging on your position from 3 directions. I'm going to need you to mark your exact location and establish a perimeter. I'll provide close air support, but with this many hostiles, it's going to be danger close. The term danger close meant that friendly forces were within the blast radius of her weapons. Any mistake in target identification or weapon delivery could result in friendly casualties. It was the kind of tactical situation that required absolute trust between air and ground units and split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. Rodriguez's response was immediate. "Roger, Kingfish. We're marking our position with strobes and infrared. Enemy forces are approximately 50 meters and closing. You are cleared hot for danger close engagement." Kazansky dove toward the target area, her aircraft screaming through the thin mountain air as she lined up her first gun run. Through her targeting pod, she could see individual enemy fighters moving between rocky outcroppings, their heat signatures bright against the cool mountain backdrop. Some were carrying weapons that looked too sophisticated for typical Taliban fighters: crew-served machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades, and what appeared to be man-portable air defense systems. "Guns, guns, guns," she announced, opening fire with her 30 cannon at a range that brought her dangerously close to the enemy air defense envelope. The distinctive sound of the GAU-8 Avenger echoed through the valley as depleted uranium rounds tore through enemy positions at 65 rounds per second. The return fire was immediate and intense. Tracer rounds streaked past her aircraft as she pulled up from her attack run, and her missile warning system activated as someone painted her with targeting radar. She deployed flares and chaff while executing a defensive maneuver that would have been impossible in a less agile aircraft. "Good hits, Kingfish," Rodriguez reported. "You stopped their advance on our eastern flank, but we've still got multiple groups moving from the north and west. These guys are well trained and they're not backing down." As Kazansky lined up her second attack run, she realized that this engagement was different from anything in her previous experience. The enemy fighters were displaying tactical discipline and coordination that suggested professional military training rather than insurgent tactics. They were using their weapons effectively, moving with purpose, and adapting to her attacks in ways that indicated sophisticated battlefield awareness. More concerning, they seemed to know how to fight an A-10 Thunderbolt II specifically, positioning themselves to exploit the aircraft's vulnerabilities and using terrain features to limit her effective firing angles. It was as if they had been trained specifically to engage this type of close air support mission. The realization hit her like a physical blow. These weren't just enemy fighters defending a compound. They were the same unit that had killed her grandfather, using the same tactics in the same type of terrain against the same tactical scenario. The trap hadn't failed, it had evolved. Now, instead of waiting for her to fly into a prepared kill zone, they were adapting their ambush to her tactical responses, learning from each attack run and adjusting their defensive positions accordingly. They were fighting not just her aircraft, but the inherited tactical instincts that had guided her approach to the battle. For 37 years, they had been preparing for this exact engagement. And now, finally, they had their chance to finish what they had started with her grandfather. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as more enemy fighters emerged from concealed positions throughout the valley. Kazansky's aircraft status display showed decreasing ammunition levels and a hydraulic system warning that indicated battle damage from the heavy ground fire she had encountered during her attack runs. Her fuel state was approaching the point where she would have to consider returning to base, leaving the SEAL team without air support in an increasingly desperate tactical situation. "Trident Actual," she transmitted. "I'm showing multiple new enemy positions activating throughout the valley. Some of these fighters are using equipment that suggests state-level military support. Are you certain about the intelligence on this target?" Rodriguez's response came through bursts of small arms fire in the background. "Kingfish, intelligence didn't prepare us for this level of opposition, but we're committed now. My team is taking casualties, and we need continuous close air support if we're going to extract successfully." The professional obligation was clear. She couldn't abandon the ground team regardless of the personal implications of the tactical situation. But as she studied her targeting display, Kazansky realized that conventional close air support tactics weren't going to be sufficient. The enemy had positioned themselves with the kind of tactical awareness that came from detailed study of A-10 capabilities and limitations. They knew her aircraft's turning radius, her minimum effective firing range, and the altitude limitations imposed by the surrounding terrain. They had positioned their air defense systems to create overlapping coverage that would force her to expose herself to ground fire during any conventional attack run. Most significantly, they seemed to understand her likely tactical responses better than she understood them herself. But her grandmother's training had included more than just navigation and tactical awareness. During those childhood camping trips, she had also learned about patience, observation, and the importance of understanding your enemy's expectations before committing to any course of action. "Trident Actual," Kazansky transmitted. "I'm going to try something different. I need you to maintain your defensive perimeter but stop engaging enemy targets for the next 60 seconds. I want them to think they've driven me off." Rodriguez's voice reflected his concern. "Kingfish, if you withdraw now, they're going to overrun our position. We don't have 60 seconds. Trust me, Master Chief. Sometimes the best way to spring a trap is to let the enemy think they've succeeded." Kazansky climbed to altitude and turned away from the target area, broadcasting on frequencies that she knew the enemy would be monitoring. "Control, this is Kingfish. I'm taking heavy damage and withdrawing from the target area. Ground team is on their own." The deception was designed to trigger exactly the tactical response that she had observed in her grandfather's mission files. When enemy forces believed they had successfully driven off air support, they typically consolidated their positions and moved aggressively to eliminate the remaining ground forces. It was a natural tactical instinct, but it also created vulnerabilities that could be exploited by an aircraft that hadn't actually withdrawn. Maintaining radio silence, Kazansky circled back toward the target area at low altitude, using terrain masking to avoid enemy radar systems. Her plan required precise timing and perfect execution, but if it worked, she could turn the enemy's tactical assumptions against them in a way that her grandfather had never been able to achieve. Through her targeting pod, she watched enemy fighters emerge from concealed positions and begin advancing toward the SEAL team's defensive perimeter. They moved with confidence and coordination, apparently convinced that the air threat had been eliminated and that they could now finish the ground engagement on their own terms. They were wrong, and in approximately 30 seconds, they were going to learn exactly how wrong they had been. The attack came from an angle that violated every principle of conventional close air support doctrine. Instead of approaching from altitude with maximum standoff distance, Kazansky came in at treetop level from the north, using a ridge line to mask her approach until she was less than 500 meters from the primary enemy concentration. Her aircraft emerged from terrain masking at nearly maximum speed, giving the enemy fighters no time to react or take defensive positions. "Guns, guns, guns," she announced, but this time the call was as much for her own tactical awareness as for the ground team. At this range and angle, she could see individual enemy fighters in her targeting display, could watch them dive for cover as 30 rounds tore through their positions with devastating accuracy. The psychological effect was immediate and overwhelming. Enemy fighters who had been advancing confidently toward the SEAL positions suddenly found themselves under attack from an aircraft they thought had been driven away. The tactical coordination that had characterized their earlier movements dissolved into confusion and panic as they tried to reorient their defenses against a threat approach they hadn't anticipated. Outstanding work, Kingfish. Rodriguez's voice carried relief and professional admiration. You broke their attack completely. They're falling back to defensive positions throughout the valley. But Kazansky knew that the tactical advantage was temporary. The enemy unit had displayed too much tactical sophistication to remain disorganized for long. They would adapt to her unconventional approach just as they had adapted to her earlier attacks, and they would incorporate this new information into their tactical assessment of her capabilities and likely responses. More immediately, her low-altitude attack run had brought her within range of small arms fire that had caused additional battle damage to her aircraft. Her hydraulic warning lights were now accompanied by indications of damage to her flight control systems that would make sustained combat operations increasingly dangerous. Trident Actual, she transmitted. I've disrupted their assault, but I'm showing significant battle damage. My aircraft may not be able to provide sustained close air support if they regroup for another attack. The admission was professionally difficult but tactically necessary. Rodriguez needed accurate information about her capabilities in order to make informed decisions about his team's extraction options. If her aircraft was no longer able to provide effective fire support, the SEAL team might need to consider alternative tactics for getting out of the valley alive. Rodriguez's response reflected his understanding of the tactical implications. Roger, Kingfish. We're going to attempt movement to the secondary extraction point while the enemy is still disorganized. Can you provide cover for our movement even if you can't conduct sustained combat operations? Kazansky checked her fuel and ammunition status, then ran a quick assessment of her aircraft's remaining capabilities. She had enough fuel for another 20 minutes of operations and sufficient ammunition for 2 more gun runs, assuming her flight control systems remained functional. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to cover the SEAL team's extraction if they moved quickly and avoided prolonged engagements. Affirmative, Trident Actual. I can cover your movement, but we need to execute this extraction quickly. My aircraft isn't going to be combat effective much longer. As she watched the SEAL team begin their movement toward the extraction point, Kazansky realized that the tactical situation had evolved into exactly the kind of scenario that her grandfather had faced during his final mission. A highly trained ground team, supported by a single close air support aircraft with battle damage, attempting to extract from a valley filled with enemy fighters who understood their tactics and capabilities. The difference was that she now understood the trap that had killed her grandfather, and she had no intention of repeating his tactical mistakes. The enemy's tactical adaptation was faster than Kazansky had anticipated. As the SEAL team moved toward their extraction point, new enemy positions began activating throughout the valley, positions that hadn't been visible during her earlier reconnaissance, but were now revealing themselves as Rodriguez's team moved into their fields of fire. The enemy commanders had been holding forces in reserve, waiting to see how the engagement developed before committing there.